Live from our ZTN studios in Harare, Zimbabwe's capital. This is Transparency and Accountability, Fighting Corruption, a program brought to you by Zimpaper's TV network ZTN in partnership with Transparency International Zimbabwe, TIZ. Hello, I'm Andy Hodges. Now today our discussion focuses on current responses to corruption during COVID-19, successes, challenges and solutions. This is in light of the coronavirus pandemic that is wreaking havoc on a global scale that has necessitated the need for social protection and humanitarian aid. Over 100 countries have formally requested emergency assistance to mitigate the effects of the pandemic. While disaster response calls for agility, it is critical that the basic transparency and sensible anti-corruption measures are maintained at all levels of social intervention. Corruption's drain on public resources can hamper government's ability to provide adequate healthcare, education and awareness, and other basic rights, especially in times of disaster. To explore today's topic, I'm joined in studio by Fadzai Jekumu, Legal and Policy Officer with Transparency International Zimbabwe, TIZ. And during the course of the program, we'll be joined through our virtual platform by Commissioner from the NPRC, Reverend Charles Masunungure, legal expert Mr. Nkosana Maposa, and Commissioner John Makamure from the Zimbabwe Anti-Corruption Commission, ZAC. Fadzai, welcome to the show.
Good afternoon, Andy. Good afternoon, viewers.
Now, let's start from the basics. What is your role as TIZ in fighting corruption?
Okay, I'll mention that Transparency International Zimbabwe is local chapter of the Global Movement Against Corruption. The global movement consists of more than 100 countries whose main mandate is to fight corruption and all its related vices through networks of integrity. Transparency International Zimbabwe has got 4 departments. By that I mean that there is the Community Mobilization and Advocacy Department, whereby we go into the communities, we conscientize the right holders on what they ought to do should they see an act of corruption within their communities, and they are also taught on how to demand accountability from their duty bearers. And we have a department that we call the Advocacy and Legal Advice Center, whereby we are assisting victims and witnesses of corruption through free legal advice. We also have a department whereby we call it the Research Department. This one works as the knowledge hub of anti-corruption issues and governance issues in Zimbabwe. This department, the Research Department, they ensure that annually they produce what we call the Annual State of Corruption Report, whereby they look at sectoral corruption and how it is happening, or how corruption is impacting different sectors in the country. And then we have the policy, legislation and institutional monitoring, from where I come from. That's the department that I belong. This department, what we do is we look at the impact or the efforts that we're doing as a nation in addressing issues of corruption in the nation. That's at a policy level. And we look at the domestication of different mandates or different advices from the international instruments such as the United Nations Convention Against Corruption. And lastly, we have the Communications Department, which then packages all the information from all these departments and share with the different stakeholders.
Wow, you've got a full plate at TIZ, don't you? Now, one thing as well you mentioned there in your briefing of what TIZ does is education, because I think one of the factors that's critical in Zimbabwe is the understanding of people to understand what exactly is corruption. You know, they see it as more just paying someone or giving a bribe or something, but it's multifaceted. So what's the education program that TIZ has to educate Zimbabweans?
We assist people in knowledge management and informing them what corruption is. As Transparency International, we define corruption as the abuse of entrusted power for public gain. And if you look at corruption, there's a petty level corruption that's between you and I, and maybe when I go to face a service provider like the health personnel, I have to pay something for me to get something that I'm entitled to. And then there's grand level corruption, whereby this takes place at the apex of the country. This is where we see flawed processes as far as the procurement is concerned. So what in Transparency International, how it defines grand corruption is abuse of high level power to just benefit a few at the expense of the masses.
Right, and of course, if any citizen finds that they are in part of corruption or someone's trying to corrupt them, they can obviously approach TIZ, and you'll help them with legal advice on what they can do and what's permissible.
Yes, that's what the Advocacy and Legal Advice Department is for.
Now, also to just a bit of a baseline, you know, there are international best practices on how to deal with corruption, and I think that it's always good. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. So maybe just briefly, or tell us what should be the best practices that Zimbabwe should follow in terms of dealing with corruption.
Okay, Zimbabwe ratified and signed the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, which is the main legal instrument which governs corruption in different countries. So this document has got 4 areas or 4 pillars of focus. They have preventative measures, and then there's criminalization, and there's asset recovery, and the last one would be mutual understanding between countries. So what we do, or what that convention speaks to, is, for example, for us to be able to prevent the occurrences of corruption, we are supposed to criminalize it. We're supposed to have policies which speak to preventing corruption. An example of such policies would be a mandatory declaration of assets by all public sector employees. And another example would be protecting the whistleblower. And then another example would be criminalizing, having sentences which act as a deterrent measure to those who want to want to commit corruption. And then there
puts them off being corrupt, doesn't it?
Yes. Yeah. And then there's another issue whereby we see that the main issue which happens as far as the grant corruption is concerned is it often goes unpunished, because those who commit that are those who conduct such are the ones who are politically exposed and protected by the law.
If you get away with it, then it shows to other people that corruption pays, so to speak.
Yes, there's an incentive to it.
But one thing that interests me is, from a legal and advocacy point of view, which is where you are at TIZ, what are the majority of cases that you get? I mean, what is the sort of corruption that's around in the country?
Okay, focusing mainly on the corruption cases that we've been receiving during this COVID-19 period, I'll look at the issue of mealie meal distribution. It shows that there are over 1,023 cases that we've received complaining about how the process is not transparent. This shows that the people on the ground, or the grassroots people, are more concerned about livelihoods issues. They're more concerned about food on the table. And then there is the issue of social welfare aid and politicization of COVID aid. There's over 1,000 cases again. Wow. On that. And then we have police brutality. We have 525 cases. And then there's unprecedented prices. We have over 538 cases. So those are the types of cases that we've been receiving throughout the COVID-19.
So it's really about bread and butter issues. I think the people are seeing what's happening with COVID-19 and the corruption that's happening, if we can call it that, in the distribution, on how it's given to, who it's given to, and that is what really affects them now, which makes a lot of sense.
Yes.
Anyway, we're now joined on the line by the National Peace and Reconciliation Commission. That's Commissioner Masunungure. Commissioner, welcome to the show.
Good morning, good afternoon.
Good afternoon,
Thank you very much for having me.
It's a pleasure. Now, let's start from the basics. What is the constitutional mandate of the NPRC?
Right. The constitutional mandate of the NPRC covers a couple of areas, but for purposes of our discussion, I am going to perhaps summarize it as dealing with disputes related to human rights violations that then create a situation where people cannot coexist, where you now need healing, you need reconciliation, and therefore our mandate is categorized into 3: dealing with the past, dealing with emerging issues, and also dealing with the issues of prevention.
Okay, now obviously we're in this pandemic at the moment. So what is the role of the NPRC in fighting corruption during COVID-19, or during particularly this lockdown period?
Right. The role of the NPRC, as you see in Section 233 of the Constitution, you will find that the NPRC is one of the 5 independent commissions that are charged with, among others, making sure that institutions of the state conduct themselves in a constitutional manner and in a transparent manner. And therefore, our role mainly is in twofold. One of it is to be able to provide oversight. As you know that we report to Parliament, we provide oversight in relation to that part of Section 233, where we are concerned about the conduct of state institutions in relation to how they conducted their constitutional mandate as well. And specifically, you will see that we are concerned also with Section 252F, which says to receive complaints from the public and take appropriate action. And Section 252H tells us to do anything incidental for the prevention of conflict and promotion of peace. And where we see activities that are contrary to that, we then alert the institutions that are supposed to deal with the issues. Therefore, also there is a concept of conflict early warning and early response to make sure that issues that can trigger violence are dealt with before they erupt.
Right. Now, sir, in terms of corruption, now, during COVID-19, have you received any cases or reported to you any cases of corruption? And also, how have you managed to resolve them, or have you resolved them?
Yes. During COVID-19, we had a couple of issues. We set up a team that was monitoring the situation, and still is monitoring the situation in relation to what I have just highlighted concerning the mandate. And, we set up a WhatsApp platform where people would report to us. And interestingly, and I would agree with the fact right there, that people are not concerned about many big issues. They are concerned, and they were concerned also, and still concerned about livelihood issues of food on the table. And we received a lot of complaints from people around the food distribution issues. And some of it had to do with they bordered around corruption, in that you will find that a truckload of 30 tons of mealie has arrived at a particular shop, and then after selling maybe 7 tons, the shop owner tell you it's finished. And in some cases, law enforcement agents were also alleged to be also going ahead of the queue and getting more than they needed to. And we had so many of those cases. And Transparency International also were conducting us to ensure that we also assisted in engaging the various institutions, for example, the ZRP, where we felt that the law had been broken, whether by their officers or members of the public, in relation to food distribution. This is primarily the main issue that was coming to us, was around subsidized milling.
So now you've received those complaints from members of the public through your WhatsApp or whatever channels, walk-in channels. What
Yes.
do you then do? How do you resolve them? What's the next stage to try and
Yes.
get some of these issues sorted out?
Yeah, we are quite a network commission, and one of the things that we have done over the years is to cultivate relations with various institutions, including state institutions, civil society organizations, and primarily for purposes of dealing with the complaints received, because the Constitution mandates us to take appropriate action as we see fit. In some cases, as I told you, we engaged the police and they gave them the actual details of what was transpiring as given by the informant. And in some cases, the arrest would be made and recoveries would be done, where the kind of looting of milling was done. But in some cases, because the caller or the informant chose to be anonymous and chose not to give further details for reasons best known to them, we wouldn't do much in such cases, because when we ask them for further details, they say, no, I no longer know this, I have forgotten this, I have forgotten that. So, but all cases where they were leased, in some cases we will deal with the district development coordinators, those DDC, who are that they chair the district drought relief committees in the communities. And in some cases, we dealt with the ministers of state, the devolution in the various provinces, to ensure that food distribution was done above board.
Now, so we know the MPRC thrives on active consultations. I mean, you've done your outreach programs, you've spoken to many thousands of millions of people around the country. From your assessment, how inclusive has the current COVID-19 response been, especially in light of corruption risk reduction? Are you encountering any challenges at all, or do you see any challenges in the process?
Well, surely, yes, challenges are always there, because this COVID-19 found us as a nation already grappling with socio-economic hardship. And obviously, one of the things that you see even in a family at home, if resources are limited, there is bound to be some complaints or disputes around that. And therefore, one of the biggest challenges that we have seen is that government has been struggling to meet the challenge of provision of service, especially, for example, when government announced that they were going to give people some social service, social security net. and send out officers through the Ministry of SMEs to record names. And there was a very high hope that government would come in. But you know very much, as much as I do, that the capacity that we have, the resources, the fiscal is limited. Companies are not operating, the tax is not, revenue is not coming in, there is inflation and so forth. And so these are some of the challenges that we also encountered in trying to forge ahead in coining solutions. Even when we engage the various stakeholders, you can actually see that there is political will to provide a service, but there is no fiscal backup for that political will.
Commissioner Masood Ngure, National Peace and Reconciliation Commission Commissioner, thank you very much, sir, for appearing on the show. Thank
you so much, Ben. Good day to you.
Very interesting what the Commissioner was saying there from the NPRC. I mean, he talked about the NPRC's role in oversight. He quoted Section 233. Also, oversight of conduct of state institutions. One area which I think was important was that because already the Zimbabwean economy was struggling, the government is struggling to meet the needs of the people, particularly on social protection nets. That is a gap, isn't it? That's an opportunity where corruption can thrive, isn't it? Where there's lack of a service to plenty of people wanting it.
Yes, that's very true. I woke up to a newspaper headline which was saying COVID-19 looting spree, and then government buys PPEs worth US $1 million. So we have got the grassroots people suffering, and they can't even access meal. And then we've got the government procuring a mask worth $28 each.
$28 US?
Yes,
okay.
Each. And in such an economy, is that the priority that we have? Of course, we have got an emergency, but now there are no checks and balances on whether the responses of the government are really for the benefit of the people and are really making sense given the tragedy that we have at the moment.
Now, one thing also that the Commissioner highlighted was that they are getting complaints, but it appears that the people complaining aren't coming with enough proof to actually say this is what happened. What is the actual process? What do they need to bring to say, look, because imagine you're walking down the road, you're a policeman or whatever public official will ask you to pay, and then you come to you as Transparency International. What proof do I need to bring? Because it's all happened somewhere far away, hasn't it?
Okay, the fight against corruption, I would like to say it's more legal. It's more legalistic in nature. That if I hear that there's something happening, if I don't have proof, there's so little that I can do. However, since we have got the advocacy and legal advice center, some of the information that we have, we then package them and then have advocacy issues running on that main issue. For example, the issue of the minimal distribution, the corruption that's purportedly is happening in the minimal distribution. What we have done is we have seen that we cannot arrest all the perpetrators. Some of them we don't have evidence, and some of them are out of our reach. But what we have done is we have written to the government to say these are the recommendations on how we can reduce corruption that's happening in the minimal distribution.
So systemic issues, I mean issues that are there, that are part of the system. How do we solve the system rather than individual policemen or individual people who are corrupt or whatever? I use policemen as an example, so please. Yeah. Yes. Is that how it works? All right, now we're now joined by Zimbabwe Anti-Corruption Commission spokesperson, Commissioner John Makamure. Commissioner Makamure, welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
It's a pleasure. Now, let's, as I asked the NPRC earlier, what is the constitutional mandate of ZAC?
Yeah, the constitutional mandate of ZAC is to combat and prevent corruption in both the private and public sectors. So the constitutional functions of ZAC are outlined in Section 255. So we investigate and expose cases of corruption in the private and public sectors. We receive complaints from the public, and we take such actions on the complaints as the Commission deems appropriate. We refer corruption matters to the National Prosecuting Authority for prosecution. We also have the function to direct the Commissioner General of Police to investigate cases of suspected corruption and report to the Commission the findings of such investigation. The other important function is to make recommendations to government and other persons on measures to enhance integrity and accountability and prevent improper conduct in the public and private sectors. So we don't only investigate, arrest, and refer matters for prosecution. We also make recommendations to government on how best the government can implement measures to promote honesty, integrity, and prevent improper conduct in the public and private sectors.
Thank you. I mean, building on that, I mean, there's been lots of cases. You heard TIZ here and also the NPRC talk about how some of the major issues that are going on at the moment in terms of corruption are bread and butter issues about maize distribution or food distribution and so forth. So
yeah.
This is a pandemic. It's obviously an unusual situation. But how is ZAC managing to handle that? Because this is something that needs to be managed right now. So how are you fighting or helping to fight corruption during this COVID-19 period?
Yeah, let me say that in the past couple of months, we have received numerous complaints of alleged rampant corruption in the distribution of food aid, in rural and urban areas. Then we also have received the complaints pertaining to management of COVID-19 resources, both public resources and donated resources. So these are matters that we are prioritizing. We are seized with such complaints and reports, and we are currently carrying out investigations. We are aware that during a crisis like this one, there are people in society who would want to benefit and line up their own pockets. Diverting public resources, donated resources for their own, for private gain. So we are aware of that. It has happened in the past. So as a commission, we then said we can't sit idly and then allow such malcontents, to divert these resources. The resources are scarce. And, some of these public resources have already been diverted by government from other pressing needs to fight the COVID-19 pandemic. Then we can't have individuals who then decide to line up their own pockets. So we are investigating several of the reports that have been made to the Commission, and we also have in place what we are calling compliance teams that go about ensuring that, for example, when it comes to food aid distribution, is being done above the board, and that any cases of suspected corruption, we quickly bring the culprits to book.
In fact, that's what I wanted to ask you. I can appreciate when you want to take an individual or an organization and you have to investigate, and that can take some time. But some of the complaints that Transparency International and yourself and NPRC are receiving are things that need to be actioned right now. So now going back on your mandate of recommendations, how do you manage those? Because we can't wait 6-7 months to get them sorted out. They need to be sorted out now. What do you do in those situations?
Yeah. So it's a combination of actions. We investigate, arrest people, and our turnaround now for investigations and arrests is vastly improved. Right. So in addition to that, we don't end there. At the same time, we then even make research into the issue, carry out further research into the issue, and then quickly make recommendations on how to plug loopholes for corruption. So ZAC pursues a combination of strategies in the fight against corruption. So that's why I then said we have in place rapid response. We are calling them rapid response teams, rapid response compliance teams. That then go up if we receive a complaint. Let's say it's to do with people jumping a fuel queue or corruption at a fuel service station. We immediately deploy our rapid response team to make sure that we address the issue there and there without even... then we can investigate and arrest later, but we bring sanity there and there. So we pursue a combination of those strategies. I agree with you that you don't want to wait for investigations, prepare a docket, and then refer the matter to the prosecuting authority. but as ZAC, we should also be seen to be acting, preventing corruption from happening.
Right. Now, I know that you said you've received complaints, and obviously they're probably countrywide, both rural and urban areas. Does ZAC manage to cover all the major towns and cities and communities? How do you manage that? Because obviously it's a large town, and we also know that ZAC has said that you haven't had the right staff or human resources in your organization. How do you manage it?
Yeah, we currently embarking on a decentralization program. It's a valid point you are raising. It's a mammoth task. There is no way ZAC can be able to cover every part of this country. But we're making efforts to decentralize to all the 10 provinces, and already we have beefed up our Gweru and Bulawayo office with investigators, public education officials. We'll soon be moving to Masvingo and Mutare. We are hoping that by the end of this year, we would have decentralized to 6 regions. But we are also now entering into what we call memorandum of understanding with various stakeholders so that we join hands in the fight against corruption. So, for example, TIZ, we have a memorandum of understanding with Transparency International Zimbabwe so that we work together to carry out public education, educate the masses about corruption. So we want to collaborate with the churches, we want to collaborate with business, we want to collaborate with labor. So we are signing various memoranda of understanding with different stakeholders. So that that's a strategy to try and cover more communities.
So, okay, during this period, you said that you have been receiving reports. What successes have you achieved? Have you arrested anybody? Have you managed to make things right in certain situations? Could you tell us the successes that ZAC has encountered?
Yeah, I would say since the beginning of the year, in terms of since this commission came into office, which is in July last year. Right. So we have managed to submit more than about 65 dockets. These are cases that have been investigated, completed, dockets prepared, and submitted to the National Prosecuting Authority for prosecution. Right? And then we have managed to achieve 5 convictions since this commission came into office. Right? We are currently seized with more than 900 cases under investigation. The number of reports have increased, right? Signifying that people beginning to have more confidence in the commission. So that's also an indicator of confidence if more and more people are coming to file reports. So currently we are investigating a major case related to COVID-19, resources, materials. I will not divulge the details, but it's a major case involving a local firm.
Okay.
So we seized with that one. Investigations are at an advanced stage. Food aid distribution. I want to say that we have managed to also monitor the distribution, just like TIZ. We have deployed our rapid response compliance teams to monitor distribution of mealie meal, for example, and we have managed to contain, some other corrupt, practices, and some of the gains are not that. When we arrest a high-profile figure, for example, like recently we arrested the Registrar General, right? Mm-hmm. We recently arrested the former chief executive of Net1. When you arrest such high-profile figures, right, then you deter others. The result may not be visible, but that on its own will deter others from engaging in corrupt practices.
Sorry, sir, please continue.
No, you can go ahead.
Now, you talked, when you were talking then, you spoke about issues of trust and mutual trust between organizations and citizens or companies. And that's a huge factor in fighting corruption. So what opportunities do you think can we expand that trust? Can we make that trust deeper, particularly during this disaster period?
Yes, that should be seen to be, like I said, responding quickly to public compliance and be seen to be addressing them. Right. We have got other entities with, ZAC works with other entities. For example, we are not the prosecutor. We are not the courts. Right. So there's need for, obviously, the public to understand what the mandate of ZAC is and how we work with these other entities. But what we are doing is through the development of a national anti-corruption strategy. We now have a strategy in place that was developed through a highly consultative process. We went about and consulted citizens in all the country's 10 provinces. So we had meetings to consult citizens. So we have a document now ready, which will be officially launched very, very soon. So in that strategy, right, we have what we call a National Anti-Corruption Strategy Steering Committee. That steering committee will be chaired by ZAC, but it comprises representatives of various stakeholders, including organizations like TIZ. Then we are going to have monitoring groups. There will be 6 monitoring groups. They will monitor the 6 strategic objectives. And each monitoring group will be chaired by a relevant stakeholder. So it won't be like ZAC chairing a monitoring group. If it's media, for example, then we'll find a media representative body to chair that. So that way we'll be cultivating, ownership of, the strategy to fight corruption and ensure that there is a stakeholder involvement. So this is something that we are pursuing, and it has never been done before. It's something that this new commission decided to embark upon.
Now, finally, Commissioner, what would you recommend to ordinary Zimbabwean citizens, to companies, to business in your fight against corruption? What should they do? How can you make it better for citizens to be able to fight corruption in Zimbabwe?
Yes, citizens must understand that it is their duty to fight corruption, and that there is grand corruption, which Father was talking about, and petty corruption. So, but there must be zero tolerance to corruption, whether it's petty corruption or grand corruption, right? So, we need to reassure the citizens, that we obviously are serious. If you want citizens to rally behind the anti-corruption fight, they must see results, which we are trying to, as ZAC, to ensure that in our work there are results. But it is their duty as well as citizens to constructively participate in the fight. When it comes to the private sector, it's very important that the private sector join hands with ZAC, and that in all these entities we must have champions for anti-corruption. Right, across the board. Then we must have integrity committees put in place in our public entities, in our private sector companies, in NGOs, to put in place integrity committees. So it's something that even ZAC is now pursuing, working with all the local authorities in Zimbabwe to put in place what we call integrity committees. And those companies, for example, that fail to deliver or that engage in corrupt practices must not be seen participating in government tenders. So as a commission, we have made a position, that's our position, and we are discussing with the government to say if company A, right, has been engaged in suspected corruption, even if there has been no conviction, that firm must never be allowed to participate in government tenders.
Commissioner John Makamura, spokesperson of the Zimbabwe Anti-Corruption Commission. Many thanks.
Thank you very much for having me.
Fadzai, he spoke very well about certain issues, and some of the points I'd like to highlight for you just to have a chat about. He talked about zero tolerance to corruption. He said citizens, companies, we must exhibit zero tolerance, doesn't matter how small or big it is. Also, he talked about companies, champions. We need to have champions in our firms, champions that also spearhead the fight against corruption internally in the companies. And also integrity committees. So I'd like you to think of those 3 things. I'll come back and ask your opinions on them, but unfortunately we're going to have to take a break. You're watching Transparency and Accountability, Fighting Corruption, a program brought to you by Zim Paper's TV network ZTN in partnership with Transparency International Zimbabwe, TIZ. Now joining us in the next section, we'll be talking to Mr. Nkosana Maposa, a law lecturer. Don't go away, we'll be right back. Welcome back from ZTN Studios in Harare, Zimbabwe's capital. This is Transparency and Accountability, Fighting Corruption, a program brought to you by Zim Paper's TV network ZTN in partnership with Transparency International Zimbabwe, TIZ. Of course, in our studio is TIZ representative Fadzai. She's here talking on the legal and policy implications, Transparency International Zimbabwe. And also, in our first segment, we spoke to Commissioner Masungungure, National Peace and Reconciliation Commission. He spoke about what the MPRC is doing, what its mandate is, and how it's fighting corruption during COVID. And the complaints they're receiving. And in fact, our second guest during the segment was Commissioner John Makamura, spokesperson from Zimbabwe Anti-Corruption Commission. And they both said pretty much the same thing, in that the reports that they're getting seem to be around bread and butter issues such as maize distribution, food distribution, and things like that. And I think Fadzai gave us some nice statistics of 1,000 complaints that they've received, politicizing COVID as well as police brutality, and most of them on food aid. Now, going back to what Commissioner Makamura was saying there, as I said before the breather, zero tolerance to corruption, to appoint champions in terms of inside institutions, to champion anti-corruption messaging, and also integrity committees. Your comment?
Okay, I think that's very important, because we are part of the international movement anyway as Zimbabwe, and we have got goals to meet before 2030, or in 2030, that's the strategic development goals. And strategic development goal number 16, an analysis says that it is important for us to attain strategic development goal number 16, which speaks to justice for all, and that way we can now attain every other SDG. And then we've got the Agenda 2063, whereby it speaks of the Africa that we want. And heads of states seem to be in agreement that the Africa that we want should be free from corruption. Once we deal with corruption, then we have the Africa that we want, whereby education is free, health services are not scarce, etc., etc. And then as far as companies are concerned, I think what should be done is taking cognizance of the fact that we now have an amended company law, Company Act. It speaks to the beneficial ownership, whereby it's saying that companies are now required to have a register of the beneficial owners, of who are the beneficial owners of a company, who actually benefit from the proceeds of company A or company B. That way, if that is made public, for now they have to do it and then file with the register of companies, but now the problem is it's not for the public consumption. So that's where the main problem is. Transparency, basically. Yes. So I think that's very important.
I mean, let's put this in numbers. I'm sure you, hopefully as TIZ, you know some numbers, because I hear numbers like $1 billion a year is lost to corruption. What kind of numbers are we talking about here? What kind of numbers in Zimbabwe that you can estimate we're losing through corruption?
More than 5 billion.
Per annum?
Yes, because what we have is the...
That's 5 billion
illicit,
US.
Yes, yes.
I'm a bit shocked.
Illicit financial flows.
That's a lot of money, isn't it?
Because Zimbabwe has got vast minerals. And then we have illicit financial flows. Number one, we have unregulated artisanal miners. Some of them we hear issues about the market, gangs, what happening in Kwekwe. The people are not selling the gold to Fidelity printers. That's a huge policy gap.
They're smuggling, if I
Yes, they're smuggling, and then they're selling it on black market. And then also we do have this issue of price hikes. Some things are being sold at double pricing. And then also now we have the petty level corruption that we're talking about, that someone has to bribe their way to accessing a passport or a license.
But can you imagine $5 billion a year, what that could do to our economy? I mean, it's just mind-blowing, isn't it, really?
That could
the impact. Yeah, that's more than our actual budget combined in terms of Zimbabwe's entire national budget. And I mean, that brings us to the point about oversight, because both the MPRC and ZAC talked about oversight, particularly of government institutions or institutions that are part of the COVID-19 fight, but also of private sector. That's a critical component of fighting corruption, isn't it? The oversight, but more importantly, the teeth to... Oversight is fine, but you also need the teeth to do something about it when you find a problem.
Okay, we have 3 arms of state. That's the executive, judiciary, and the parliament. And parliament has got the legislative and oversight role. But what we see is that during this process, during this COVID-19 crisis, we have seen that the government has declared it a national disaster or a national state of emergency. Thereby, the parliament has taken a backseat. and that's not how it's supposed to be. I think Parliament should still be providing their oversight role, even in emergency situations. They should have emergency committees responding to what the government is doing, and also ensuring that whatever response that the Parliament is doing is not also affecting the government's duty to respond to emergency situations.
Yeah, because you're right. I mean, at the end of the day, even though we're in a national disaster, we should speed up things rather than suspend things, isn't it?
Yes,
I mean,
yes,
that's
yes.
the point.
Precisely.
And so the institutions should still work, the tender board should still work, the procurement board should still work. Nothing should really change, otherwise there will be gaps for corruption in there.
Corruption, yes.
That's interesting. I think we're now joined on the line by Mr. Nkosana Maposa. He's a law lecturer. Nkosana, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. How are you, sir?
I'm fine, thank you. How are you?
Awesome, great.
Now, as a rule of law expert, what is your opinion on fighting corruption during an outbreak like COVID-19 that we're having now? Is it feasible, in the context of that?
I think your question raises some antecedent acts. This is not the first time that we are encountering a crisis or a disaster. We saw during the Chimani and the Bindura cholera outbreak that there were claims. Actually, Transparency International conducted a research where they found that there were reports of bribery, extortion, patronage, influence peddling. But what I can say is that such situations or outbreaks create or present an opportunity for scammers and business people to defraud citizens, usually with the complicity of the government. In a way, what I can say now is that the COVID-19 situation has weakened institutions in such a manner that you cannot really have the usual accountability and oversight that Fadzai was talking about right now. As to the feasibility of fighting corruption, I need to make some preliminary points. The first point is that it would appear that in Africa, corruption is a way of life, number one. Number two, I can also say that fighting corruption is not easy because corruption is a secretive crime. Number three, I can say that there are certain opportunities that have been created for the corrupt, especially in public procurement. So with the levels of development assistance that we've received, there are several ways in which we can try to fight against corruption. Number one, I think we need a clear, objective, and transparent criteria for the qualification of intended beneficiaries and recipients. I'm raising this point because a few weeks ago, the Minister of Finance announced that there was a financial package for the vulnerable or indigent in our country. But there were no modalities as to how they were selected. It wasn't really, the process was not transparent.
It was opaque, it wasn't transparent.
Yes. The second point that I want to raise is that we must also account for the risks and vulnerabilities of disbursements and targeting methods. I think it's also linked to the first one. The third one is to the feasibility. We need an open or clear communication and outreach channels to raise awareness and understanding of beneficiaries. I think this goes to the fact of asymmetries of information, that people are not aware of certain projects that the government has come up with. The third one, I would say, maybe the feasibility, the issue of ICT, using technology for efficient, transparent, and accountable disbursement of resources. Again, this one, as you know, that in the world, I think we have more than 3 billion people who lack access to the internet. It then raises the question of access. How many people have access to the information or access to information? But I would say maybe we need civil society acting in terms of Section 52(1) of the Constitution, which provides that every Zimbabwean citizen or permanent resident, including juristic persons and the media, has the right of access to any information held by the state or by any institutional agents of government at every level, insofar as the information is required. in the interest of public accountability. So feasibility, I'm a bit ambivalent because there are issues such as political will here. There are issues that have to deal with openness, open government in Zimbabwe.
Now, so how, in your opinion, how is Zimbabwe doing in its fight against corruption? And also, more importantly, we always talk about the legal instruments are in place to fight corruption, but it appears that legal instruments and actual doing are two different things. Do we have strong enough instruments to fight corruption and hold corrupt people to book?
There's a strong perception that our country is corrupt. If you look at the 2019 Corruption Perception Index, it ranks us, I think, 158 out of 108 and a score of 24 out of 100. But in terms of instruments, I'll start at the international level. We signed the International Convention Against Corruption in 2004 and ratified it in 2007. This is the first binding international instrument against corruption. It provides for the criminalization, prevention, asset recovery, and technical assistance and cooperation at the international level. I really like to draw your attention specifically to your Article 5 of that convention, which speaks to the responsibility of the state to review its anti-corruption regime. But I'll also draw your attention to the African Convention on Preventing and Combating Corruption. This one is our regional instrument to prevent corruption. It imposes certain obligations on the country, and it's linked to the Constitutive Act of the African Union. We also have the SADC Protocol, which is our own regional from the SADC level. But internally as a country, we have an incredible constitution, and this constitution, I would argue, that it presents or provides a new culture. It's a culture of justification. I'll even argue that the Constitution really provides for corruption to be perceived as more or less like a value, because if you view it as a priority, then it can be changed through negotiation. So corruption is more like a value that is embedded because we have a justiciable Declaration of Rights in Chapter 4 of the Constitution and the Chapter 13 institutions, the ZAC, the NPA, and so on. But your question relates to the effectiveness of these institutions. It's one thing to have law, legal frameworks and institutions, and it's another to implement these. I would then say the question of implementation goes to political will, but political will I would not really define it per se, but look at some of the factors that affect the legal instruments that we have. The first one that I have here is what we can call individual factors. By individual factors, I mean your personal beliefs, aspirations, motivations, and values. These can affect regulatory compliance in anti-corruption. The second factor that I want to discuss here is what we can perceive as organizational factors. By organizational factors, we're looking at the organizational mandates of institutions. For example, here we have your ZAC. That is really our premier anti-corruption institution, how it discharges its mandate. Number two, under organizational factors, we can then look at the culture of compliance or corruption in a particular jurisdiction. Remember, this is not the first time we are discussing corruption. The current incumbent has actually referred to corruption as a deep-seated problem, and also averring that the police, the judiciary, and almost in the private sector are corrupt. So the culture is also related to that. So the third point that we want to look at under the ability of the country to implement anti-corruption strategies is what we can call relational factors. These relate to the participation of citizens and civil society in anti-corruption. I've come across reports that as citizens, we are really not serious enough, or we're indifferent about corruption in our country. But the last point that I'll mention are social factors, where, for example, there is a legacy or remnant of an authoritarian or dictatorship. It's always difficult to come up with or to have political will. So how do we then remedy this situation? I think one of the factors that I've mentioned there is the issue of, well, we have ratified international instruments, our laws, we have your criminal code, we have the constitution. The main factor relates to the independence of the institutions. For example, the ZAG, I heard that they are investigating corruption, but we want to see more being done, not selective application of the law or incomplete investigations or clashes between institutions. Instead, we want to have synergies between the Zimbabwe Anti-Corruption Commission and the National Prosecuting Authority.
Mr. Nkosana Maposa, Law Lecturer, many thanks for participating on the show.
Thank you very much.
Fazai, very interesting there from a legal perspective. I just wanted to cover a couple of issues and then get to a few questions for you. He talked about more needs to be done in terms of the different institutions working together, where synergies are there, more involvement by citizens. He said citizens and civil society need to do more. I think civil society is doing quite a big job, particularly TIZ. But citizens seem to not regard this as a serious issue. Also technology, the use of technology in trying to fight corruption, transparency, whether we have technological means using websites to show what is being spent, what the grants and loans are being spent on, so citizens know. But the one area I want to talk about is he talked about your Transparency International Zimbabwe's research documents, where you can even highlight the scams that are going on and so on. Maybe just quickly talk about those documents and where people can actually access them.
Okay, the one that you referred to is the corruption risk assessment. It was conducted sometime end of last year, and it was looking at the corruption risks within humanitarian aid distribution. It was focusing on Chimanimani and Budiriro, Glenview Budiriro. And then what happened was, what the findings of that research, it found out that during times of crisis like this, corruption seems to grow, these avenues of corruption. And then what the participants said, or the respondents, is that there is collusion, and then there is the issue of politicization of aid, whereby we are only given aid not because you're affected by the pandemic or by the disaster, but because which party do you support. And then also there was the issue of flawed tender processes. That seems to be recurring also from the research, and also now during this COVID-19.
It seems to be a recurring thing that we're not fixing. I mean, yes. I think that's what your reports are telling the citizens.
Precisely. So
finally, unfortunately, we're coming to the end of the show, but I'd just like to get your final thoughts. Policy recommendations, or any kind of recommendations that you would give right now, particularly in view of the COVID-19. What would you suggest? What would you recommend, not just to ordinary citizens, but also government and the private sector?
Okay, what I would say is, I'll go back to the issue of ICTs. There is need to be as transparent as possible and to give as much information out there as possible, because we're looking at a government which is elected by the people and for the people, so they ought to be accountable to us. We can have a website. The government can actually have a website on monitoring the funds, and also it should have a distribution matrix. Who got what? What did we receive from donors, be it private, public, and what did you get from the national fiscus, and what did you do with those funds? Are we now at a point where we are running out and then now we need some more? So there should be just a website, tender processes, who got the tender, why did they get the tender, and it should be just a mouse click away. And then we have got an issue of policy gaps, whereby we do have, Zimbabwe is perfect, the constitution is perfect, we do have great legislation, but now we also lack what I was saying, that the whistleblower protection, whistleblower and witness protection, and also we don't have anything to follow the money after you are convicted of being corrupt and you have got a safe haven somewhere outside the country. How do we then follow the money so that we get you don't keep on benefiting even after serving your sentence? You don't keep on benefiting from the proceeds that you illegally got. And then the other issue, the last one, would be for parliament oversight.
Thank you very much. We have come to the end of our show, but I'd like to quote what Fadzai said: the government elected by the people for the people, and they must be held to account and transparent when it comes to any form of spending, because that way we can cut down corruption. And as she says, follow the money. Now, you've been watching Transparency and Accountability, Fighting Corruption, a show brought to you by ZTN in partnership with Transparency International Zimbabwe, TIZ. As we head to a close, I'd like to thank Fadzai Jekumu from Transparency International Zimbabwe. Many thanks for coming on the show. And also, as well as our panelists who joined us virtually during the show, that's Commissioner Reverend Charles Musunungure from the MPRC, law lecturer and legal expert, Mr. Nkosana Maposa, and Commissioner John Makomure, spokesperson of Zimbabwe Anti-Corruption Commission. Today we were focusing on current responses to corruption during COVID-19, successes, challenges and solutions, and recommendations for the way forward. Many thanks to our partner, Transparency International Zimbabwe, TIZ, who made this program possible. And not forgetting all our viewers who followed this discussion through our various online platforms. And we please would like to hear from you via our Facebook page, Zim Papers TV Network, or of course our Twitter at ZTN News. And of course there you can find other ZTN programming. Well, that's it for me today. I'm Andy Hodges. Goodbye, and you all be safe.